The iron gate of the Oakmont estate slammed behind Winifred Oakmont with such finality that she felt the reverberations in her chest, matching the violent rhythm of her breaking heart. She stood there in the dust of the Wyoming road, her silk dress already collecting the grit of her new reality, watching as her father's broad back disappeared into the house where she had lived all 22 years of her life. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would never see the inside of those walls again. "You are no daughter of mine," her father had said just moments before, his face purple with rage. "Not if you choose that penniless saddle tramp over your family, over your duty, over everything we have built." But she had chosen. She had chosen Yates Kirby, the cowboy with calloused hands and an honest smile who worked the ranch 2 miles south of town. She had chosen love over comfort, and now she stood alone on the road to White River, South Dakota, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of Yates's promise that he would love her no matter what came. The late afternoon sun of July 1883 beat down mercilessly as Winifred began walking toward town. Her family had discovered her secret courtship with Yates just that morning when her younger sister had found a letter tucked beneath Winifred's pillow. The confrontation had been swift and brutal. Her father, Edmund Oakmont, was the wealthiest cattle baron in this corner of Wyoming territory, and he had already arranged for Winifred to marry Harold Pemberton, a banker's son from Cheyenne, whose family fortune rivaled their own. "You will marry Harold in 3 weeks' time," her father had declared. "This foolishness with the hired hand ends now," but Winifred had refused. She had stood in her father's study, her mother weeping in the corner, her 2 brothers flanking their father like sentries, and she had said the words that sealed her fate. "I love Yates Kirby, and I will marry him, with or without your blessing." The silence that followed had been deafening. Then her father had ordered her brothers to escort her from the property, taking nothing with her, not even the horse she had ridden since childhood. She was to be cast out completely, erased from the family as if she had never existed. Now, as she walked the dusty road, her fine leather boots already beginning to blister her feet, Winifred fought back tears. She had known there would be consequences, but she had not anticipated the completeness of her family's rejection. Still, when she thought of Yates, of the way his gray eyes crinkled when he smiled, of the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to the horses, of the way he made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life, she knew she had made the right choice. The sun was lower in the sky by the time she reached the outskirts of White River. The small town consisted of a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church with a white steeple, and a handful of saloons that catered to the ranch hands and cowboys who drifted through. Winifred had been to town countless times, but always in her family's fine carriage, always dressed in her best clothes, always treated with the deference due to the daughter of Edmund Oakmont. Now she walked down the wooden sidewalk and saw people she had known her entire life turn away, having already heard the news of her disgrace. She made her way to the small boarding house where Yates rented a room. Her heart hammered as she climbed the exterior stairs to the 2nd floor and knocked on his door. There was a long moment of silence, then the sound of boots on floorboards, and the door swung open. Yates Kirby stood there in his work clothes, his dark hair disheveled, his face registering shock and then immediate concern as he took in her appearance. He was 25 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with a face that was more rugged than handsome but held an openness and honesty that had drawn Winifred from the first moment she met him. "Winifred," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What happened?" She tried to speak, but suddenly the weight of everything that had occurred crashed over her, and she felt her knees buckle. Yates caught her before she fell, his strong arms wrapping around her, and he pulled her into his small room, kicking the door shut behind them. He guided her to the single chair beside his bed and knelt before her, his hands holding hers. "Tell me," he said softly. So she did. She told him everything, from the discovery of his letter to her father's ultimatum to her refusal to marry Harold Pemberton, to the way her brothers had physically removed her from the house. As she spoke, she watched Yates's face, saw the play of emotions there. Anger at her family's treatment of her, worry for her welfare, and underneath it all, love so profound it made her chest ache. When she finished, Yates was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and paced to the small window overlooking the street. "I never wanted this for you," he said finally. "I never wanted you to lose everything because of me." "You didn't take anything from me," Winifred said firmly, rising from the chair. "They took it from themselves by refusing to accept my choice. Yates, I knew what I was risking. I chose you anyway. I would choose you 1,000 times over." He turned from the window, and she saw the moisture in his eyes. "I have nothing to offer you," he said. "I have $47 to my name, this room that costs me $2 a week, and the clothes on my back. You grew up in a mansion with servants and fine things, and everything a woman could want." Winifred crossed the small space between them and took his face in her hands. "I want you," she said, "just you. Everything else is just things, Yates. They do not matter." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt the tremor that ran through his body. "I will take care of you," he whispered against her hair. "I swear to you, Winifred, I will work every day of my life to make sure you never regret this choice." "I could never regret choosing love," she said. They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, and Winifred felt something settle in her chest. It was frightening, yes, to have lost everything she had known, but it was also exhilarating in a way she had never experienced. For the first time in her life, she was free to make her own choices, to forge her own path, even if that path was uncertain and difficult. That night, Yates gave Winifred his bed while he slept on the floor, insisting on propriety despite the circumstances. The next morning he was up before dawn, and when Winifred woke, she found him sitting at the small table, counting out coins. "I need to find work that pays more," he said when he saw she was awake. "I have been saving to buy a small piece of land, but that will take years at my current wages. We need money now, for food and lodging and to get you proper clothes." Winifred sat up, pushing her tangled blonde hair from her face. Her dress was wrinkled from sleeping in it, and she was acutely aware that she had no other clothes, no brush for her hair, none of the things she had taken for granted her entire life. "I can work too," she said. Yates looked up, surprise evident on his face. "You have never worked a day in your life, Winifred." "Then it is time I learned," she said firmly. "I will not be a burden to you, Yates. We are in this together." Over the next few days, they both sought employment. Yates found work at her ranch 15 miles outside of town, a place owned by a gruff old cattleman named Samuel, who agreed to pay him $30 a month plus room and board for both Yates and Winifred. It was hard work, dawn to dusk, herding cattle and mending fences and breaking horses, but Yates was grateful for it. Winifred, meanwhile, approached Mrs. Chen, the woman who ran the town's laundry. Mrs. Chen was a Chinese immigrant who had faced her own share of prejudice and hardship, and she took one look at Winifred's determined face and hired her on the spot for $10 a month. The work was back-breaking, standing over steaming washtubs for hours, scrubbing stubborn stains until her hands were raw, but Winifred threw herself into it with fierce determination. They moved into the small cabin at Samuel's ranch, a one-room structure with a pot-bellied stove, a narrow bed, and little else. It was cramped and spare compared to Winifred's childhood home, but she loved it because it was theirs. They were married by the circuit preacher who came through town 2 weeks after Winifred's exile, a simple ceremony with Samuel and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. Winifred wore a plain cotton dress that Mrs. Chen had given her, and Yates wore his best shirt, the one without any patches. They had no rings, no celebration, no family present. But when Yates said, "I do," and kissed her for the first time as her husband, Winifred felt a joy so complete it brought tears to her eyes. Life settled into a rhythm over the following months. Yates worked the ranch from sunup to sundown, and Winifred divided her time between helping Mrs. Chen with laundry and learning to manage their small household. She, who had never cooked a meal in her life, learned to make biscuits and stew over their small stove. She, who had always had servants to clean, learned to sweep floors and wash dishes and mend Yates's work clothes by lamplight. It was hard. There were nights when Winifred's hands were so raw from laundry work that she could barely hold a fork. There were days when Yates came home so exhausted he could barely speak, collapsing onto their bed still wearing his boots. But there were also moments of profound happiness. Mornings when they woke before dawn and lay tangled together, talking softly about their dreams. Evenings when Yates would teach Winifred to play the harmonica he had bought from a traveling merchant. Sunday afternoons when they would ride out to a small creek on the property and sit together on the bank, their feet in the cool water, simply being together. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with brutal winds and heavy snow. The work became even harder. Yates spent long days riding through snowdrifts to check on cattle, returning home half frozen and barely able to feel his fingers. Winifred continued her work at the laundry despite the cold, though Mrs. Chen insisted she take breaks to warm her hands by the stove. It was during one of those harsh winter days in February of 1884 that Winifred discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when Mrs. Chen confirmed it with a knowing look and a pat on her hand, Winifred felt a rush of emotion so intense she had to sit down. Joy, certainly, but also fear. They were barely making ends meet as it was. How would they manage with a baby? She waited until that evening to tell Yates. He had come home late, covered in snow, exhausted from a day spent rescuing cattle that had wandered into a ravine. She helped him out of his frozen coat and made him sit by the stove with a cup of hot coffee. Then, her heart pounding, she told him. Yates sat very still for a long moment, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Then he set the cup down carefully and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "A baby," he said softly. "Yes," Winifred said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know we do not have much, and I know this will make things harder," but she did not get to finish because Yates had pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his face buried in her shoulder. She felt him shaking and realized with surprise that he was crying. "Yates," she said, alarmed. He pulled back and she saw tears streaming down his face, but he was smiling, his gray eyes bright with emotion. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice breaking. "We are going to have a family." "Yes," Winifred said, her own tears starting. "We are." They held each other for a long time, the wind howling outside their small cabin, the fire crackling in the stove, and Winifred felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was her family now. This man, this baby growing inside her, this simple life they were building together. It was worth more than all the wealth and comfort she had left behind. The months that followed were challenging. Winifred's pregnancy was not easy, and there were days when the morning sickness was so severe she could barely work. Mrs. Chen was understanding. allowing her to take breaks and adjusting her hours, but Winifred hated feeling weak or useless. She pushed herself harder than she should have, determined to contribute to their meager savings. Yates, meanwhile, took on every extra job he could find. He worked on his days off, helping other ranchers with difficult tasks, breaking horses that others were afraid to touch, doing whatever paid. He was saving every penny he could, knowing they would need it when the baby came. In May, as Winifred's belly grew round and prominent, they received their first letter from Winifred's family. It was from her younger sister, Victoria, and it was brief. "Father has disowned you completely. Mother weeps for you daily but will not go against father's wishes. I miss you terribly. I hope you are well. Your sister, Victoria." Winifred read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in the small wooden box where she kept her few precious possessions. It hurt, knowing her mother grieved but would not reach out, knowing her father remained implacable in his anger. But she also felt a strange sense of relief. She had wondered if perhaps her family would relent, if they would seek reconciliation, and she had not known how she would respond. Now she knew there would be no overtures from that direction, and she could focus entirely on the life she was building with Yates. Summer arrived hot and dry. Winifred grew increasingly uncomfortable as her pregnancy advanced, and the heat made everything worse. She finally had to stop working at the laundry in July, just 2 months before the baby was due, because the steam from the washtubs combined with the summer heat made her dizzy and faint. Mrs. Chen hugged her goodbye and pressed a small package into her hands. 3 tiny gowns she had sewn for the baby. With Winifred no longer working, money became even tighter. They lived on beans and biscuits, occasional eggs from the chickens Samuel kept, and whatever Yates could hunt in his scarce free time. Winifred tried to hide her discomfort, not wanting to burden Yates with more worry, but he saw through her brave face. One evening in late August, as they sat outside their cabin watching the sunset, Yates took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about your family, about the money and comfort you gave up. Do you ever regret it?" Winifred looked at him, at his profile silhouetted against the orange sky, at the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, at the calluses on his hands that held hers so gently. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Yates, they wanted me to marry a man I did not love, to live a life that was not my own, to be a decoration in their grand plans. This life is hard, yes, but it is ours. We chose it. And I would rather have 1 day of genuine love and freedom than a lifetime of gilded captivity." He turned to her, and the expression on his face was so tender it made her heart ache. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said. "Stronger than any man I have ever met. You never complain, you never ask for more than we have. You just keep going with grace and courage." "I learned from you," Winifred said softly. "You work so hard for us, Yates. You sacrifice your rest, your comfort, everything to take care of me and our baby. If that is not love, I do not know what is." They sat there as the sun set, holding hands, and Winifred felt at peace despite everything. The baby came on a stormy night in early September. Winifred had been feeling strange all day, a tightness in her belly that came and went, but she had said nothing to Yates, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily. But when her water broke as they were preparing for bed, and the pain intensified rapidly, she could no longer hide it. Yates rode through the storm to fetch the midwife, a weathered woman named Harriet, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Harriet arrived soaked but efficient, taking charge of the situation with calm competence. Yates was sent to boil water and fetch clean cloths, and then he was relegated to pacing outside in the rain while Winifred labored inside. It was a long night. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, stark flashes, thunder shaking the walls. Inside, Winifred fought through wave after wave of pain, clinging to Harriet's steady voice guiding her through. She thought of her mother, wondered if her mother had thought of her during her own labors, wondered if perhaps even now her mother was thinking of her. But mostly she thought of Yates, of the life they had built, of the family they were creating, and she drew strength from that. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally came, arriving with a lusty wail that brought Yates crashing back through the door despite Harriet's protests. Winifred, exhausted and sweaty and more tired than she had ever been in her life, looked up to see Yates's face as Harriet placed the baby in his arms. "A son," Harriet announced. "A healthy boy." Yates stood frozen, staring down at the tiny, red-faced infant in his arms. The baby quieted, staring up at his father with dark, unfocused eyes. Yates's face crumpled, and he sank to his knees beside the bed, holding the baby out to Winifred with trembling hands. "Look what we made," he whispered, his voice choked with tears. "Look at him, Winifred. He is perfect." Winifred took their son in her arms, and the rush of love she felt was so overwhelming it took her breath away. He was perfect, with a tiny nose and miniature fingers that gripped hers with surprising strength. She looked from the baby to Yates, saw the tears streaming down his face, and she smiled through her own tears. "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Yates said softly, James Edmund Kirby." Winifred's breath caught. Edmund was her father's name. She looked at Yates questioningly. "No matter what he has done, he is still your father," Yates said gently. "And this boy is his grandson, whether he acknowledges it or not. Maybe someday things will change. But even if they do not, I will not let bitterness poison our son's name." It was such a generous gesture, such a profound act of grace, that Winifred fell in love with Yates all over again. "James Edmund Kirby," she repeated, testing it. "It is perfect." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for a tiny human being. Winifred was exhausted in ways she had never imagined possible. But every time she looked at James, every time Yates came home and his face lit up at the sight of his son, she felt a joy that made all the difficulty worthwhile. Money was tighter than ever. Babies, Winifred learned, needed things. Clothes that had to be washed constantly, blankets, soap, and though she nursed James herself, her own need for food increased. Yates worked longer hours, sometimes not coming home until well after dark, and Winifred worried about him, about the toll the constant labor was taking on his body and spirit. It was in October, when James was just over a month old, that things came to a head. Yates had been working on breaking a particularly difficult horse, a wild Mustang that Samuel had caught and wanted to sell. The horse was dangerous, unpredictable, and Yates had been working with it carefully for days. But on this particular afternoon, something went wrong. The horse reared and threw Yates, then kicked him as he tried to roll away. Samuel and the other ranch hands got Yates back to the cabin, his face pale with pain, his ribs bruised and possibly cracked. The doctor was summoned from town, a luxury they could not afford but that Samuel insisted on paying for. The diagnosis was 2 cracked ribs and severe bruising. Yates would need to rest for at least 2 weeks, the doctor said, longer if he wanted to heal properly. Winifred nursed Yates through those painful days, all while caring for James. She saw the frustration and worry on Yates's face, knew he was agonizing over the lost wages, over his inability to provide. She tried to reassure him, but words felt hollow when their savings were nearly depleted and winter was coming. It was Samuel who came to their rescue. The old rancher appeared at their door one evening, hat in hand, and told them gruffly that he was advancing Yates 2 months' wages against future work. When Yates tried to protest, Samuel cut him off. "You are the best hand I have ever had," Samuel said bluntly. "Honest, hard-working, good with the animals. I am not about to lose you because of money. Take the advance, get through the winter, and you can work it off come spring." After Samuel left, Yates sat on the bed, staring at the money in his hands, and Winifred saw tears on his cheeks. She sat beside him, James asleep in her arms, and leaned her head on his shoulder. "People can be kind," she said softly, "when we least expect it." "I have never had anyone help me like this," Yates said quietly. "My whole life I have had to fight for everything, had to make my own way with no one to rely on. I do not know how to accept help." "You accept it with grace," Winifred said, "and you pay it forward when you are able. That is what good people do." Yates healed slowly over the following weeks, and by the time winter set in properly, he was back to work, though Winifred noticed he winced when he moved too quickly, and sometimes pressed his hand to his ribs when he thought she was not looking. She wished she could tell him to rest more, to heal completely, but they both knew that was not an option. Winter that year was even harsher than the one before. Snow piled up in drifts taller than a man, and the temperature dropped so low that water left in a bucket overnight would be solid ice by morning. Keeping the cabin warm was a constant battle, and Winifred spent much of her time huddled by the stove with James, trying to keep him comfortable. It was during a particularly brutal cold snap in January of 1885 that they heard the news. Edmund Oakmont had died suddenly of a heart attack. The word spread through town quickly, and when it reached Samuel, he made a special trip to the cabin to tell Yates and Winifred personally. Winifred sat very still as she processed the information. Her father was dead. The man who had cast her out, who had refused to acknowledge her existence for the past 18 months, was gone. She felt a complicated tangle of emotions: grief for the father she had once known, anger at the man who had rejected her, and a profound sadness that he had died without ever meeting his grandson. "You want to go to the funeral?" Yates asked gently. Winifred looked down at James, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I do not know if I would be welcome," she said quietly. "He was your father," Yates said. "You have every right to be there." In the end, Winifred decided to go with Yates beside her. They bundled James in every warm thing they had and made the journey to the Oakmont estate on a borrowed horse. The funeral was held at the grand house, and as Winifred approached the gate, she had been thrown out of all those months ago. Her heart pounded with anxiety. Her brother William answered the door. He was 27 now, and he looked older than she remembered, his face lined with stress. He stared at her for a long moment, then his eyes dropped to the baby in her arms. "Winifred," he said finally, "you came." "He was my father," she said quietly. William nodded slowly, then stepped aside. "Mother will want to see you." The house was full of mourners, mostly wealthy ranchers and businessmen who had been Edmund's associates. Winifred felt every eye on her as she walked through, aware of her plain cotton dress, of the baby in her arms, of Yates at her side in his worn work clothes. She held her head high, refusing to be ashamed of her choices. Her mother was in the parlor, dressed in black, surrounded by sympathetic friends. When she saw Winifred, her face went white, and she stood abruptly. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the room. Then her mother crossed to her, and Winifred saw that she looked older too, her hair grayer, her face more careworn. "Winifred," her mother whispered. "My dear girl." "Mother," Winifred said, her voice catching. Her mother looked down at James, and something in her face broke. "May I?" she asked softly, Winifred hesitated only a moment before placing James in her mother's arms. Her mother looked down at the baby, and tears began streaming down her face. "He looks like you did," she said softly. "When you were born. Oh, Winifred." "His name is James Edmund," Winifred said quietly. "After father." Her mother looked up sharply, surprise evident in her face. Then she looked past Winifred to where Yates stood a respectful distance away. "Is that him?" she asked. "The cowboy?" "Yes," Winifred said. "That is my husband, Yates Kirby." Her mother studied Yates for a long moment, and Winifred could not read the expression on her face. Then she said softly, "He looks like a good man." "He is," Winifred said firmly. "He is the best man I know." They stayed for the funeral service, standing at the back of the crowd, as the preacher spoke words about Edmund that sounded both true and incomplete. Winifred remembered her father as he had been when she was young, before he became so consumed with wealth and status, teaching her to ride, laughing at her childish jokes, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see the parade in town. That was the father she mourned, not the man who had cast her out. After the service, William approached them. He looked uncomfortable, his hands twisting his hat. "Father changed his will," he said quietly. 3 days before he died, he added a codicil. Winifred felt Yates stiffen beside her. "What sort of codicil?" she asked warily. "He left you something," William said. "Not much, given the circumstances, but he left you the small ranch property on the eastern border, 200 acres, a decent house, and a small herd of cattle. It is not the fortune you would have inherited if things had been different, but it is something." Winifred stared at her brother, unable to process what he was saying. "Why?" she finally managed. "He disowned me." William shook his head. "I think he regretted it at the end." He would never say it out loud. His pride would not let him, but Mother said he had been looking troubled for weeks. Then suddenly he called for his lawyer and made the change. He said, William paused, his voice rough. He said that if you had the courage to choose love over money, then maybe you deserved to know that love could exist alongside security. Winifred felt tears streaming down her face. Her father had never apologized, never reached out while he was alive, but he had done this. It was not forgiveness, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. It was a recognition that perhaps he had been wrong. Yates put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, crying quietly. William looked away, giving them a moment, then cleared his throat. "There are papers to sign. Legal things. But the property is yours, Winifred. Yours and your husband's." Over the next week, they made the transition from Samuel's ranch to their own property. The house was small, just 3 rooms, but it felt like a palace compared to the 1-room cabin they had been living in. There was a real bedroom, a kitchen with a proper stove, and a sitting room with a fireplace. The barn was in decent condition, and the herd consisted of about 50 head of cattle, enough to make a modest living if they managed things carefully. Samuel was sorry to see them go, but happy for their good fortune. "You earned this," he told Yates as they shook hands goodbye. "Not because of the inheritance, but because you worked hard and stayed true. That is worth more than any money." They moved in during early February, and Winifred spent the first few days simply walking through the house, marveling at the space, at the fact that this was theirs. No rent to pay, no landlord to answer to, just their own property to build a life on. Yates threw himself into the work of running the ranch with renewed energy. He hired 2 young cowboys to help with the cattle, paying them fair wages from the small amount of money that had come with the property. Winifred, meanwhile, focused on making the house a home. She planted a vegetable garden as spring approached, learning from a book she found in the house. She sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town with her own money, saved carefully from her laundry work. She cooked meals in her proper kitchen, and marveled that she actually had space to move around. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with James playing at their feet, now a sturdy 9-month-old learning to crawl, Yates said quietly, "I never imagined we would have something like this. I thought we would spend our lives scraping by, working for other people, always just barely making ends meet." "Does it feel wrong?" Winifred asked. "Accepting the inheritance?" Yates was quiet for a moment, considering. "At first it did," he admitted. "I wanted to prove I could provide for you without any help from your family. But then I realized that this is not about pride. Your father gave you this property, but we are the ones making it work. We are the ones putting in the effort and the sweat and the long hours. This success is ours, Winifred. We are earning it every day." She reached over and took his hand. "My father wanted to prove that money was more important than love," she said softly, "but I think at the end he realized he was wrong. You have given me more in these 2 years than all the wealth he accumulated in his lifetime. You have given me a true partnership, genuine respect, and a love that is not contingent on me being someone I am not. That is worth more than any inheritance." Yates pulled her close, and James, seeing his parents together, crawled over and pulled himself up on Yates's leg, demanding to be part of the moment. Yates laughed and scooped him up, and they sat there, the three of them, as the sun set over their own land, their own home, their own hard-won life. The months that followed were not easy. Running a ranch required constant work, and there were setbacks. A fence that collapsed in a storm, 3 cattle lost to predators, a dry spell that threatened the grazing. But there were also triumphs. The successful sale of calves at market, the first vegetables from Winifred's garden, James's first steps taken across the kitchen floor while Yates was out working, and Winifred shrieked with joy and pride. Winifred's mother began visiting, tentative at first, as if afraid of being turned away. But Winifred welcomed her, and gradually they rebuilt their relationship. It would never be what it had been before. Too much had happened, but it was something. Her mother doted on James, and Winifred saw in her face a regret for all the time lost. William and her younger brother Charles visited occasionally as well, though it was always somewhat awkward. They were running the main Oakmont ranch now, managing their father's legacy, and the gulf between their lives and Winifred's was stark. But they tried, and Winifred appreciated the effort even when the visits were uncomfortable. Her sister Victoria came most often, usually staying for several days at a time. She was 20 now and engaged to a banker in Cheyenne, a match their mother had arranged. But when Victoria talked about her upcoming wedding, Winifred heard a resignation in her voice that broke her heart. "Do you love him?" Winifred asked one afternoon as they sat shelling peas together. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "I could learn to," she said finally. "He is kind enough, successful. Mother says I will want for nothing." "That is not what I asked," Winifred said gently. Victoria looked at her, and there were tears in her eyes. "I am not as brave as you," she said quietly. "I do not have the courage to give up everything for love, and part of me resents you for showing me that it was possible, because now I know what I am settling for." Winifred put down the peas and took her sister's hands. "It is not too late," she said urgently. "Victoria, you do not have to go through with this. You could—" "I could what?" Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp. "Run away like you did. To what? I have no skills, no way to support myself." "You were lucky, Winifred. You found a good man who was willing to work himself to death to take care of you. But that is rare. Most women in your position would end up in much worse circumstances." It was a harsh truth, and Winifred could not deny it. She had been fortunate in Yates, fortunate that he was exactly the man he appeared to be. She thought of all the ways things could have gone wrong, and she felt a rush of gratitude for the life she had. "I just want you to be happy," she said softly to Victoria. "I will be content," Victoria replied. "That will have to be enough." The wedding took place in June of 1885, a grand affair in Cheyenne. Winifred and Yates attended, and it was strange to be in that world of wealth and formality again. Winifred wore a dress her mother had made for her, fine fabric but simple in design, and she felt the stares of the other guests, heard the whispers about the disgraced Oakmont daughter and her cowboy husband. But Yates walked beside her with quiet dignity, and when he spoke to the other guests, he was polite but not deferential. He did not apologize for who he was or how he made his living, and Winifred loved him for it. They did not stay long after the ceremony, both of them eager to get home to James, who they had left in the care of Mrs. Chen. Summer passed in a blur of work and heat and long days. Winifred discovered she was pregnant again in August, and this time the news brought pure joy rather than the anxiety of the first time. They were stable now, not wealthy but comfortable, and a second child felt like a blessing rather than a burden. Yates was thrilled, spinning her around in the kitchen when she told him, then immediately apologizing and setting her down carefully as if she might break. Winifred laughed at his concern, assuring him she was fine, and they spent that evening making plans for the future, talking about how they would need to add a room to the house, how James would be a big brother, how their family was growing. The pregnancy was easier than the first had been. Winifred was stronger now, her body accustomed to physical labor, and she felt well throughout most of it. She continued to work around the ranch, tending her garden and helping with the lighter chores, and Yates fussed over her constantly, trying to make her rest more than she wanted to. Winter came again, their third together, and it felt less daunting than the previous ones. They had a solid house, plenty of firewood, food stored for the cold months, and livestock that were well tended. James was a lively 2-year-old now, running everywhere on sturdy legs, chattering constantly in his own version of language that only Winifred and Yates could interpret. The baby came in March of 1886, during a late-season snowstorm that reminded Winifred of James's birth. But this time the labor was shorter, and by the time dawn broke they had a daughter. Harriet, the midwife, announced it with satisfaction, and Winifred held her tiny daughter with a sense of completion. Their family felt whole now, husband, wife, son, and daughter. They named her Rose Catherine, and she was different from James from the start. Where he had been loud and demanding, she was quiet and observant. Where he had been restless, she was content to simply watch the world around her. Yates was utterly smitten, spending hours just holding her, marveling at her tiny features. "I am outnumbered now," he joked one evening, looking around at his wife and 2 children. 3 against 1. "You would not have it any other way," Winifred replied, and he laughed because it was true. Life continued its rhythm through the spring and summer. The ranch was doing well, the cattle healthy, the business steady. Yates had earned a reputation as an honest dealer and a skilled rancher, and people came from surrounding areas to buy stock from him. Winifred's garden flourished, providing vegetables not just for their family but enough to sell in town. In August, Winifred's mother arrived for a visit and pulled her aside for a private conversation. "I want to tell you something," her mother said quietly. "I want you to know that I am proud of you." Winifred felt tears spring to her eyes. In all her life, through all her accomplishments as a child and young woman, her mother had never said those words. "Your father and I, we thought we knew what was best for you," her mother continued. "We thought wealth and status would make you happy. But watching you now, seeing the life you have built, I realize we were wrong. You are happy, genuinely happy in a way I have never been. You have a partner who truly loves you, who works beside you rather than just providing for you. You have built something real and meaningful. That takes courage I never had." "It is not too late, Mother," Winifred said softly. "You could still," but her mother shook her head. "My life is what it is, but I can at least acknowledge that yours is better. You chose love, Winifred, and you were right to do so." They held each other for a long moment, and Winifred felt a healing of something she had not realized was still broken. The years rolled forward, each bringing its own challenges and joys. In 1887, they expanded the ranch, buying an adjacent property that came up for sale. In 1888, James started school in White River, riding into town each day on his own pony. In 1889, Rose turned 3 and proved to have a talent for charming everyone she met. In 1890, they added another room to the house, and Winifred discovered she was pregnant once more. This third child, another son they named Thomas, arrived during a hot July evening in 1891. He was somewhere between his siblings in temperament, more outgoing than Rose but calmer than James had been. Yates now had 2 sons to teach ranching, and he began bringing James with him on his work days, showing the 8-year-old how to care for the animals and mend fences and all the skills he would need. Winifred watched them together, her husband and her son, and felt a deep contentment. This was the life she had chosen, the life she had fought for. It had not been easy, and there were still hard days, days when money was tight or the work was overwhelming or she felt exhausted. But it was real, and it was hers, and she would not trade it for anything. In 1893, 10 years after they had first married, Yates surprised Winifred with a gift. He had saved money for months, keeping it secret, and one evening after the children were in bed, he presented her with a small box. Inside was a ring, a simple band of gold with a single small diamond. "I know it is not much," he said, looking almost embarrassed. "Nothing like what you could have had if you had married that banker fellow, but I wanted you to have something, a symbol of what we have built together." Winifred stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Yates, it is absolutely perfect." He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. She looked at it sparkling in the lamplight, then looked up at her husband. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day when I showed up at your door after my family cast me out?" "I said I had nothing to offer you," Yates replied quietly. "You were wrong," Winifred said firmly. "You offered me everything that truly matters. You offered me partnership, respect, genuine love, and a life of meaning. That is worth more than all the money in the world." He pulled her close, and they stood there in their simple kitchen, holding each other. 2 people who had chosen love over comfort and found that love had brought them everything they needed. The years continued, each adding new chapters to their story. James grew into a capable young man, taking on more responsibility at the ranch. Rose showed a talent for numbers and began helping Winifred manage the household accounts. Thomas was still young but showed signs of inheriting his father's gentle way with animals. In 1896, Winifred's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep, and at the funeral, William told Winifred that their mother's last words had been about her, saying she was grateful that at least one of her children had found true happiness. By 1898, 15 years after that day when Winifred had been cast out for choosing love over wealth, the Kirby Ranch was one of the most successful in the area. Not the largest or the richest, but known for quality livestock and fair dealing. Yates was respected throughout the region, and Winifred was known for her sharp mind and kind heart. Their children were healthy and happy, growing into fine young people. One evening in late summer, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, James, now 16 and already taller than his father, Rose 13 and reading a book by lamplight, Thomas 7, and playing with a wooden horse Yates had carved for him, Winifred leaned against her husband's shoulder and said softly, "We did it." "Did what?" Yates asked, his arm coming around her shoulders. "We proved them wrong," she said. "My father, everyone who said that love was not enough, that we would fail. We proved that love combined with hard work and dedication and partnership is worth more than any fortune." Yates kissed the top of her head. "We did it together," he said. "Everything we have, everything we are, we built it side by side." "I would do it all again," Winifred said quietly. "Every hardship, every difficulty, every moment of uncertainty, because it led to this, to us, to this life." "As would I," Yates replied. 1,000 times over. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Winifred thought about the girl she had been 15 years ago, standing outside her family's gate with nothing but the clothes on her back and faith in her heart. She thought about all the moments since then, the struggles and the triumphs, the poverty and the eventual prosperity, the love that had sustained them through it all. Her family had cast her out for loving a poor man, believing that money was the foundation of happiness. But she and Yates had proven them wrong in every way that mattered. They had shown that genuine love, respect, partnership, and shared purpose were the real treasures in life. The money had come eventually, through hard work and a measure of luck, but it was the love that had made everything possible. "Tell me about when you first saw me," Winifred said, a familiar request. Over the years, they had fallen into the habit of retelling their story to each other, especially on quiet evenings like this. Yates smiled, his gray eyes crinkling at the corners just as they had all those years ago. "You came to the ranch with your father to look at horses," he said. "You were wearing a blue dress, and your hair was pinned up all proper, and you looked like you belonged in a painting, not a dusty corral. But then you started asking questions about the horses, real questions that showed you actually understood them, and I realized you were more than just a pretty face. You were smart and curious and kind to the animals. I fell in love with you right then, though I knew I had no business loving someone so far above my station. I fell in love with you that day too," Winifred said softly. "You treated me like a person, not like an ornament or a prize. You talked to me about things that interested me, listened when I spoke, never once made me feel like I was less because I was a woman. That was the moment I knew I wanted to spend my life with you, no matter what it cost." "It cost you everything," Yates said, a note of old pain in his voice. "No," Winifred corrected firmly. "It cost me things, material possessions and social standing, but it gained me everything that truly matters. It gained me you, our children, this life we have built. I am richer now than I ever was in my father's house, even when we were living in that one-room cabin barely scraping by. Because I am rich in love, in purpose, in genuine happiness. You cannot put a price on that." They sat there as darkness fell, surrounded by the sounds of their children and the peaceful evening settling over their land. This was their legacy, not wealth or status, but a family built on genuine love and mutual respect. They had proven that love was worth more than money, not by dismissing the need for financial security, but by showing that love provided the foundation that made prosperity meaningful. In the years that followed, their story would become something of a legend in the area. People would tell the tale of the cattle baron's daughter who gave up everything for love and found happiness in a simple life with a cowboy. Some would romanticize it, making it sound easier than it was. Others would use it as a cautionary tale, focusing on the hardships they endured. But those who knew them best understood the real truth, that Winifred and Yates had built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals sustained by genuine love, and that their willingness to sacrifice everything for each other had ultimately brought them everything they needed. Their children grew and eventually married and had children of their own. James took over the main ranch operation, proving to be as capable and honest as his father. Rose married a schoolteacher and opened a school in White River, educating the next generation. Thomas became a veterinarian, the first in the family to attend university, made possible by the prosperity his parents had built. Winifred and Yates grew old together, their hair turning silver, their faces lined with the marks of a life well lived. They spent their later years watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had played, sitting on the same porch where they had spent countless evenings over the decades. And through it all, the love that had started so long ago, that had survived family rejection and grinding poverty and all the challenges life could throw at them, remained strong and true. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, Yates took Winifred's hand and said the same words he had said on their wedding day. "I promise to love you and work beside you for all the days of my life." And Winifred, now 62 years old but with eyes that still sparkled with the same determination and love they had held at 22, replied with the same words she had spoken then. "And I promise to stand beside you in poverty or prosperity for as long as we both shall live." It was a promise they had kept every single day of their 40 years together, and it was a promise they would continue to keep until the end of their days. They had proven beyond any doubt that love, genuine and true and backed by commitment and hard work, was worth more than any fortune. Their family had cast Winifred out for loving a poor man, but that poor man had given her riches beyond measure. A lifetime of partnership, respect, dedication, and a love that never wavered or diminished but grew stronger with each passing year. That was their legacy, the story they left for their descendants. Not the ranch or the money or the material success they had eventually achieved, but the proof that when two people truly love each other and are willing to work together through any hardship, they can build something more valuable than any inheritance, more lasting than any fortune, and more meaningful than any life of ease and comfort. They had chosen love, and love had given them everything,